We've all seen these pieces in thrift shops and yard sales, those 60s and 70s laminate dressers that are often neglected and overlooked. Let me tell you, there is a hidden gem here. I'm going to turn this piece into a beauty. Stay tuned. My name is Angie and I refinish furniture. Sometimes I paint and sometimes I don't, but I always do what I can to save old pieces from the trash. Welcome to my workroom. Okay, so hear me out. I know at first glance this doesn't really look like something that would be worth saving, but with a lot of these laminate pieces, even though the tops and sides are laminate, often the drawers, legs, and frames are solid wood, even though the sides and tops are this laminate product which is prone to bubbling and all sorts of finish issues. If you see a piece, have a quick look at it. Look at the underside of the drawer, the inside, and you can usually tell if something is solid wood. You can see here there's two separate pieces that have been glued together. You can see the seam in this shot here. This is my ideal mid-century laminate dresser flip because these crappy laminate coatings on the drawers can be sanded off. Now this is what confuses people sometimes with these dressers. This actually says walnut on the back. They're referring to the finish, not the actual material in this case. So that's definitely something to think about if you're just starting out and you see something like that written on the back. Just make sure that they're actually referring to what the piece is made of and not just the finish. This piece is pretty dusty, so I'm giving it a good cleaning with the vacuum, and then I'm going to spray it down with a non-abrasive scrub pad and some heavy-duty degreaser cleaner. I am going to be painting part of this piece, mainly the laminate pieces, so I need to make sure that this is completely free of wax and build up fun furniture polish because people, even though it's not real wood, still used things like Pledge on pretty much everything back in the day. So as I was cleaning, I noticed a pretty significant issue here at the bottom. This is a pretty bad repair. I don't know yet what I'm going to be able to do, but I'm going to take it apart and have a look. Ideally, this piece would be remanufactured and replaced. I don't have the tools to do that, so pretty much my only option at this point is to attempt to separate these pieces that were badly glued and try to re-glue them. I'm not sure yet at this point how that's going to pan out, but I have to try. You can see that this tab at the end is completely in sideways, and this is it's just a bad job all around. So I'm going to be hitting this with the heat gun to try to soften the glue enough to get these pieces apart, and then I will reassess at that point. Well, I'm going to try to soften the end here first so I can pull out this little middle section. Probably took about 3 or 4 minutes of heat to get it soft enough to pull out. There are some types of glues that will soften faster with heat. Fortunately, yellow wood glue is not usually one of them. Getting these other bits apart probably took about 5 additional minutes to soften enough to pull apart, and I'm trying to be careful not to damage the wood fibers too much while I do this. I already know that these pieces are not going to sit flat once I clean up all the old wood glue because there's just too much prior damage, but I don't want to do any extra damage, if that makes sense. So wood glue doesn't bond very well to other wood glue. It bonds to wood fibers, so I need to try to pull off as much of this old glue as possible, which is definitely easier said than done, but I got off as much as I could. This piece is separated pretty badly from where they drove the screw down, so I'm going to carefully pry it off, clean it up, and see if I can get it to sit more flush at least than it was already. So now that these have been cleaned up and they slide well together, I'm going to put some wood glue on each side, getting in all the little cracks and crevices, clamp them together, and hope for the best. You can see where they had driven the screws down. I actually am going to be using some wood epoxy to fill those holes. Wood epoxy is a great product. It's actually stronger than wood once it's cured. So any remaining gaps I'm going to be filling with that wood epoxy, and hopefully I end up with a pretty strong piece in the end. Sanding laminate to paint is a lot easier than sanding laminate to stain, and you actually, believe it or not, you can stain this stuff. There's a bit of a process and it's not easy, but I'm actually going to do a video on that soon. But for now, I just need to scuff sand enough to give the primer and paint something to stick to. So these areas that were initially raised and swollen, I'm actually using the sander to cut into the laminate, which is going to expose kind of the midsection of it. This is okay, I have to get this flat. I'm going to be adding a primer before painting. Anytime you cut down into that sort of cardboard-like layer of the laminate, you want to make sure you use some sort of either a clear coat or a primer before you paint, or your paint is going to absorb differently in those spots and it's just going to look strange. Okay, so this is all smooth now. By the way, this was a 180 grit sand pad. There are a few little spots where it's actually recessed slightly, so I'm just feeling all of these areas to see where I need to put filler. And there's really only a couple, so I'm just using a little bit of this sort of spackle type product. It goes on pink and turns white when it's ready, and then later on I will sand that off smooth again. Because I know these drawers are solid wood, I'm using an 80 grit pad to blast through this weird papery like finish on the front. And then once that's done, I'm going to use a 180 grit to smooth things out. But start off with an 80 and you'll get through it a lot faster. Word of caution here, make sure that this is actually a laminate coating that you're sanding through and not real wood veneer. It is super easy to confuse the two, especially when you're just starting out, and there's nothing worse than thinking you're sanding through a laminate piece and you find out you're actually sanding through the veneer. It's not the end of the world if you sand through and it's wood underneath, but a lot of times it is pressed wood or plywood, and that's never a fun surprise. Some of you may be wondering why I'm choosing to prime this piece when I haven't primed other pieces that were similar. The reason is I have sanded through that top layer and I need to make sure that before I paint, my finish is completely uniform. Otherwise it's going to look patchy and not very good. Make sure you stir your primer really well. It tends to get clumpy if you haven't used it in a while. And these tinfoil sheets from the dollar store I like using better than the plastic liners. It's also great for in-between coats. You can just use one of these to wrap up your roller and keep it moist. I'm actually going to be using 2 coats of primer here. My first coat will be fairly light, and then I'm just going to do a very, very light hand sanding in between, just to get out any little dust nibs or anything that might have settled into the primer. I'm also going to be painting the legs, so I'm just going to give them a very light hand sanding just to scuff up the surface a little bit, give that paint something to adhere to. I'm using Fusion Mineral Paint in the color Sacred Sage to paint the legs and the base of the dresser. Goes on a little bit lighter than it actually dries. This is actually one of my favorite colors to use. And these little clips are great because I can just stand them up while they're drying and they're not touching anything, and it's perfect. Okay, so now to deal with this disaster. I've cleaned off as much of the glue as I possibly could. It's not perfect, but I didn't want to mess up too much of the wood fibers underneath. I still don't know yet how this is gonna go, but I think considering that disaster was fairly solid, this, in theory anyway, should be a lot better. I'm being careful to line this up properly so that it's not too far over on either side. Just making sure this is level before I clamp everything down. I'm using several clamps here, and I will let this set up for the rest of the day while I'm working on other parts. This is the wood epoxy. It's a 2-part product. You basically just mix it together in your fingers and put it where you want it. This stuff dries super hard. Like I mentioned before, it's actually reported to be stronger than wood. So here's hoping that it fills up those gaps nicely and gives me a nice strong solid board when I'm finished. I'm using a 50-50 water to paint ratio here for my whitewash. Again, I'm using Fusion Mineral Paint. This is the color Goddess Ashwagandha, and I'm so sorry if I'm pronouncing that wrong. I'm not entirely sure how to say it, but it's a very beautiful, neutral, slightly off-white color, and I like it a lot, especially for whitewash. And I especially like doing this on these old laminate pieces because it's basically the complete opposite of what I start with. It goes from dark and dingy to light and airy, and it's just my favorite. These pieces are often overlooked too, so you can generally pick them up a little bit cheaper. And as most of you know, my goal with doing this furniture is not to take a piece that is totally fine and just give it a new look. That's great for the people that want to do that, but for me, my whole goal here is to keep as many pieces as possible out of landfills. When you have a piece that's structurally sound but just needs some updating or doesn't look very nice, those are my favorite pieces to work on. So to backtrack just slightly here, once my second coat of primer was completely dried, I just used a 220 grit sand pad to knock down any little dust nibs, and then I got into painting. I ended up painting 3 coats on this dresser. The original hardware is not my favorite, but it's a bit of an off size, and I would have had to spend more to replace it than I would want to for a piece like this, so I'm opting to clean it really well, give it a nice light sanding with a fine grit sand pad, and I'm going to be spraying it in matte black, which is one of my favorite colors when paired with any kind of whitewash. It's just a nice modern look. I'm using this Fusion Beeswax Hemp Oil combo to seal everything. You'll notice it gives a slightly warmer tint to the drawers. I'm okay with that. It's actually kind of the color tone I was going for anyway. And now my Frankenwood here is ready to be sanded. It's completely dry. Glue is solid. So I sanded it smooth, and I'm using just a bit of gel stain. I know it's a different color than the wood is naturally, but I'm just trying to blend this in just a little bit more. Okay, so here is our Frankenwood all finished. It's actually better than it looks. It's very, very strong now, and I'm not at all worried about putting this back on the dresser. I feel like if that other repair held up this long, then this should be pretty good. So I'm just getting everything lined up, and then I'm going to use a rubber mallet to tap this in all along the length of it. Everything looks good, so I'm going to spin this around and turn it on its front so that I can put some nails in the back here where I had removed the staples initially when I took the board off. I am definitely in the home stretch now of this piece. I'm going to be using the same Fusion Beeswax on the painted parts. It's just going to slightly deepen the color and help protect the paint. Now, Fusion has a built-in top coat. You don't always need to do it, and I don't sometimes, but in this case I want a slightly different color, and I just love the feel of it, to be honest. Okay, let's revisit this dark and dreary piece one more time. This is how it came to me, and let's have a look now at what this seemingly worthless piece of furniture looks like.